started. There are a lot of people who like rule number 1. So go ahead and talk about why rule number 1. What did you like about rule number 1? Whoever wants to share, even if you're not voted for it, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark to share. Okay, who would like to go first? Joe.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I really liked rule number 1 because I think it set up the entire book. And in evaluating it, I saw a lot of different things the second time I looked at it that I didn't see the first. So initially, the idea that he contrasts Freud and Jung and talks about the role of the community. Specifically, he says, Freud and Jung, with their intense focus on the autonomous individual psyche, place too little focus on the role of the community in the maintenance of personal mental health. And, I think that that's really important because it sets up the idea of how social institutions are really important and what makes up a social institution. And there are some core concepts that are really important underneath that. A social institution contrasted with a creative achievement is a social institution would be like explored territory or order, or if you even want to go so far as to say the masculine, if you're comparing it to the Tao Te Ching. Whereas creative achievement, he really sets up nicely as unexplored territory. It's chaos and it's more yin-like. So the question really then becomes, how do you navigate social institutions, which is something that I found to be, extremely important in my life, actually. So the one line is that, or paragraph that I liked, if I could go ahead and read it, it would be, social institutions are necessary but insufficient, the section. And then he speaks about highly social creatures such as we are must abide by the rules to remain sane and minimize unnecessary uncertainty, suffering, and strife. However, we must also transform those rules carefully as circumstances change around us. This implies as well that the ideal personality cannot remain an unquestioning reflection of the current social state. Under normal conditions, it may be nonetheless said that the ability to conform unquestioningly trumps the inability to conform. However, the refusal to conform when the social surround has become pathological, incomplete, archaic, willfully blind, or corrupt is something of even higher value, as is the capacity to offer creative, valid alternatives. This leaves all of us with a pertinent moral conundrum. When do we simply follow convention, doing what others request or demand? And when do we rely on our own individual judgment with all its limitations and biases and reject the requirements of the collective? In other words, how do we establish a balance between a reasonable conservatism and revitalizing creativity? And I think that really captures having this idea of one foot in chaos and one foot in order. Because how do you then navigate the hierarchical institution, these social institutions, and really begin to understand how to reinvent them? And having this, understanding, you can start to really transform. You have to have a respect for what the social institution is standing for, but you have to look at how you can reinvent it. And personally, for me, where I work, I have a lot of ideas on how to reinvent what we're doing in our jobs. But understanding the social hierarchy and how it functions is something I didn't understand. And that was critical because not understanding that, you could have the best ideas in the world and they're not necessarily going to transform anything. So this is where we have to be we really truly have to understand what the institution stands for, why it operates, how it functions, and understand why people don't want to change, and what is possible in order to impact change. And I think that this is, it teaches us a little bit. He gives us a formula for hierarchies, how to deal with hierarchies in social institutions. And I think that it's also telling us to kind of challenge our own conventional ways of thinking and at the same time. So that has this like conservative bend to it, but it also has this creative, innovative, liberal bend to it as well. So I really liked that rule, and I thought that it really kind of set up the whole book, because it's the difference between chaos and order. So
Wonderful. Great, great summary and great commentary. Thank you, Joe. Next up is going to be Max, followed by Maritza. Max. And folks,
My thing was
take your time to talk about this. Go ahead.
okay. Well, mine was like a little bit more, kind of abstract. The way I felt like when he was speaking about this rule, obviously he's under attack by like certain people for certain things in certain ways. So I could see, I got a feeling, I really got that like impression a lot in this book, where it was kind of like maybe he was aware, maybe he was not aware, but he's really kind of responding to the like feedback that he has gotten, and then he saw like the flaws and like what they were doing. So to me, I felt like carelessly, attacking and denigrating institutions and creative achievements is kind of a postmodern trend to tear things down. So it's kind of like this ongoing trend that we got to. If there's any fault in it, you just tear it apart. And, oh, it doesn't really matter. It's not really anything. Then so it ends up with everything not meaning anything, which is the ultimate kind of like postmodern in philosophy. Once you go like super existentialism, or like once you go into absurdism and all this other stuff, like so it goes back to who was that, Hemingway, that every man's death diminishes me. So in a sense, every time you tear down someone else's achievement, every time you tear down like an institution, every time you tear down like something without really understanding it fully, like Joe said, but just seeing like maybe a flaw in it, or seeing like maybe something not perfect about it, then you just completely dismiss it. Then you actually are dismissing everyone's, because it's gonna soon be your turn, and then to your own philosophy and everything like this. So I think that that trend really like endangers, just various schools of thoughts, and just any kind of real opportunity for creativity or someone being extraordinary, by making everything extraordinary seem flawed or something like that. So I really got that impression a lot from this rule. And obviously, like again, with the respecting and understanding things versus attacking them and only focusing on what they're not, and not seeing them for what they are. So I think this rule really highlighted it.
Wonderful. Thank you. So folks, just go ahead and type a exclamation mark when you want to speak. So it's going to be Maritza, followed by Hyman. Maritza.
Um, in this rule, I saw the caution being mentioned on looking at anything from a either or perspective. So, when he says, do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement, what I'm hearing is that if we're looking at a social institution that we find to be deplorable or reprehensible, or whatever negative terminology we're placing upon it, we should pause and consider that there is another aspect, that that is not the only story that this institution has, that there is more to it. And by taking the time or the times to consider more perspectives when looking at something that we find to be deplorable or to be non-functional, we actually put ourselves in a better position to become an enabler of a positive something for this thing that we find to be deplorable. Because by acknowledging that it may have at one point had a purpose, or there may have been some good to it, we now have more ability to attempt to enable a pivot. And if we're talking about something that is so far beyond us that we don't believe we have the ability to touch it in any way, that might also be part of the problem. That might be part of that statement of carelessly denigrating. Like if we don't consider, like, for example, government, if we think the government where we happen to reside is just absolutely unsalvageable, sitting and stewing over that statement and just throwing it all away does nobody any good, and it affects zero change. If we stop and we consider maybe what it used to be, what it could be, and what potentially we as, small and significant individual can perhaps do, that while it won't, change this social institution, it may be a small cog in this larger machine that will enable movement in a direction that we can perhaps find less deplorable. So that's what I hear here when he's saying, just don't carelessly throw things that you don't like away about these big institutions. It's not an either or scenario. Very few things in life are either or. And I hear Peterson reminding us of that. And there's a second portion I hear in this chapter. He talks about the fact that, he makes the case that many structures that are found to be wanting or deplorable, or that we would denigrate, they're just in need of updated. They need creative people to infuse some type of vitality into them. And that might be overly optimistic, but as someone who is a believer that, change starts with the single individual and it explodes outward, that makes sense to me. The idea that we are all creative people. Our creativity may look vastly different, but every one of us has some kernel that we can use to create some type of change. And even if it's a change that absolutely, it's not going to overnight fix a vast institutional problem. But if we adopt the attitude that one small thing we do may make a difference, and then we go and we share it with Joe, and then Joe adopts, one small thing, and then he knows tons of people. What if he goes and he tells 4 people? And this might be slightly optimistic, but not really, because of the fact that forward movement is always better than stagnation or even rejection. And that's kind of what I hear in this rule, is that if we refuse to just throw something away, there's still hope. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is going to be Hyman. Folks, if you want to comment about rule number 1, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Hyman.
Thanks. I appreciate it. So basically, I'm going to speak on rule 3.
We'll come to rule 3. Right now, we are just doing rule 1. So we're going to.
I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. So what we're going to do, rule 1, and then we're going to go to rule 2, and then we will come back to all the rules.
Okay.
Thank you. Next up is Becky.
Can someone go ahead of me? Can I come back after I gather my thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Whenever you're ready, just go ahead and type exclamation mark and I'll put you in.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is Becky.
I like rule one because this is majority of what I do for work is working with innovation. And so when I see this rule, I think of the fundamental importance of starting off with something that's stable. So the social institutions, these things are tried and true. They've survived. And then you carefully inject innovation, creativity, the thoughts of the individual on top of what already works in order to keep it going. But when you have the extreme of one and the other, you end up getting death, but different. You have on one end, nothing that changes, death by stagnation. And then on the other end, you have death by instability because everything's new. You tear down the existing and you introduce all these different possibilities without any kind of understanding of what will come out of it because everything is new and untested. So I appreciate this rule and I really like how Peterson intertwines the two into each other and gives very practical ways of acknowledging how to work the individual into society in terms of comparison of the hierarchies and your peers versus your superiors versus people who may report into you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Hyman. Hyman, go ahead.
Thank you. Apologize. And yes, thank you. Interesting. And thank the previous speakers, taking away a lot of wonderful tidbits. With that said, this makes me think immediately about how Dr. Peterson speaks and quotes a biblical reference about those who will inherit the earth. They have swords and keep them sheathed. And he talked about the meaning of sheath and how the ability to flex a certain amount of not for status, but not power, but being able to defend oneself, or if one has the ability. Let me change gears. I gained some insight from this. Obviously, for me personally, it made me dial into my experiences with jujitsu early on as a young person, and learning how to defend self and protect myself from all the magnificent channels of things that become available to us through the experiences of life, and how, you know, a certain discipline and a mechanism of protection can be very useful. One needs to understand, to set a boundary. I thought about the reference of the lobsters that he used, which I love. And I think that there is a correlation, obviously, with, the ability to protect things of that nature. And I'm going to leave it there. I'm a little razzled, but thank you. Thank you.
The thing that I find interesting about this rule is that it is a negative of a negative. So don't denigrate. Okay, I find these kind of ideas very powerful. It's kind of removing something. It's like you're saying, don't denigrate. You know, it's not saying what to do, but what not to do. That realize that you need both kind of order and you need chaos. So don't denigrate order, don't denigrate chaos, don't denigrate the stability that is supporting you, and don't denigrate the element that is going to take you forward. So I like that part of it. Okay, next up is going to be rule number 2. Who finds rule number 2 to be the most interesting or most useful, and why? go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you'd like to talk about rule number 2. You can talk about it even if you have not, even if you're not voted for it. So rule number 2 is imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. No takers? Okay, I'm surprised, but we can go to the next one. Joe. Joe, I really appreciate you typing exclamation marks. Okay, I really appreciate you for doing that. But let's start with Victor, and then we can go to you. So
Oh, good. Oh, thank God. All right, thank you.
Okay, how about this, Joe? We'll come up with something so you can tell me whether this is something that firstly, what happens is that there is a flow to these kind of conversations. When somebody starts talking, everybody feels comfortable talking.
Exactly.
I really appreciate Joe doing that. And Joe, whenever I find that I can switch to somebody else, I will go ahead and switch. But I really appreciate the fact that I can depend on you.
Thank
so
you.
Victor, Joe, and then Dave. Victor.
Thank you, Victor.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikanta. So when I started this book, the title says Beyond Order, and I was really looking forward to see the notion of beyond order or the chaos from the eyes of Jordan Peterson and what he wants to say. And this rule, right, as Joe mentioned, the first rule set up the book perfectly, and the second rule actually goes into the idea of chaos, meaning whatever we want to do, that is by definition, that is something that we have not done yet, and we are going and doing something new. And for that, the rule actually says go single-mindedly at that. So that also brings in a little bit of discipline, a little bit of the focusedness. And this particular rule set up how to look into chaos. So in that regard, I like this rule a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Next up is Joe, followed by Dave. Joe.
So I'm going to take a unconventional approach to appreciating this role. I think that this really kind of showed the wide range of Peterson and how he can use different thoughts and ideas and incorporate it into a rule and into a whatever he's trying to communicate. And one of the things that we've spoken quite a bit about is having a literate culture here, and language and the importance there of language. And he said once a culture becomes literate, something that has happened only recently from the historical perspective, those stories can be written down. It is at this point roughly that the myth and ritual might be said to transform itself into a religion. The imitation of communication is the greatest, most memorable acts of necessity, distillation of communication of the patterns of the deepest wisdom of mankind. And he just in this particular instance, he's capturing when things actually become a ritual and when things become a regular practice. And once you have a literate culture, these are the things that we start to develop. And he links this back into how to understand rules and breaking rules within that. And I found that to be a little bit to be fascinating, because he says, later on that those who break the rules ethically are those who have mastered them first and disciplined themselves to understand the necessity of those rules and break them and keep in keeping with the spirit rather than the letter of the law. But you have to understand the spirit of the law first. So you have to understand these rituals, these languages, and all these things first. Then you know what you can break and why you're breaking it. And I find that to be like a really powerful insight, how he's taken this literate culture, shown how it kind of becomes something more, becomes a religion, and it becomes the power of myth at a certain point. And then you start to understand these things and you know when to deviate from them. I know that wasn't completely clear, but this in this particular chapter, it really has helped out, like with me understanding some of the other discussions that we've had related to language.
Wonderful. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Shrikant. And I will admit, it's been several weeks since I did read the chapter, but I've forgotten the details. But just to me, the title is showing the importance of concentration and focus to achieve a goal. That temptations are of distractions are so tempting to get off track, to step that foot into chaos and get up and the other things. So yeah, I enjoy his principles, and I think this was a good rule. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Becky.
I originally read the chapter title and I'm like, I don't know if I agree with that. But then as I was going through the things I've underlined in the chapter, I was like, okay, I agree with this. So what I didn't like about the name of the title was that it implied a like rigidity that was like, this is it. You go after one thing and that's all. But on page 65, that's not really what he's trying to say. He's saying that you do it with to the level that you develop some depth and there's substance to what you're doing in order to guide you, and you're changing in the process. And perhaps that single-minded target, it morphs into something else. And so it's not, oh, this is it. And if I can read from 65, you do not choose what interests you, it chooses you. Something manifests itself out of the darkness as compelling, as worth living for. Following that, something moves us further down the road to the next meaningful manifestation. And so it goes as we continue to seek, develop, grow, and thrive. It is a perilous journey, but it is also the adventure of our lives. Think of pursuing someone you love. Catch them or not, you change in the process. Think as well of traveling you have done or of the work you have undertaken, whether for pleasure or necessity. In all these cases, you experience what is new. Sometimes this is painful, sometimes it is better than anything else that has ever happened to you. Either way, it is deeply informative. It is all part of the potential of the world, calling you into being, changing you forever, for better or worse, in consequence of your pursuit.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. All right. The next rule we're going to go with the maximum number of votes is rule number 5. Do not do what you hate. Who would like to go? Who would like to talk about that? What did you get from that rule? Rule number 5. Do not do what you hate. Roger.
I think this one was really good because it kind of highlights that, along with the other one that I like about hiding things in the fog, that natural tendency that we all have, that, I mean, we have for a good reason, right? That our normal order, we start to become blind to it because it's just so routine. But at the same time, we can't ever be blind to the fact that we might not like some aspects within that. And it's this idea of like, well, I'm not happy and I'm not happy, but not quite identifying why you're not happy and not willing to really ask yourself what's going on. I really like how he kind of breaks that down, this ability to kind of wake up to your own circumstances and realize and be very like self-aware and insightful as to how you feel about your own condition, and then trusting that that's just that's really you, right? That's like that if you listen to that thing that's telling you, hey, I don't like this, hey, this is it, that you can actually, that your life will be better off if you actually follow that, which is kind of the constant, logocentric perspective that Peterson tends to embody.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Next up is Joe, followed by Hyman. Joe.
I'm just trying to kind of gather my thoughts and remember this rule, because initially I didn't like the title of it, but I realized it had a lot to offer as far as a rule. And one of the things was how to distinguish, like, not doing something that you don't like and doing something that actually conflicts with your moral principles. And that's a very important distinction to really make, because we all have to do things that we don't like. And I thought that this rule could get misconstrued initially as something as, all right, just don't do what you just don't like. Well, no, he gives us a whole formula as to how to evaluate that and to remain true to ourselves in that process. So that's what I really took away from that particular rule. It wouldn't have made my top 3, but it still had a lot of very important parts to it. It also, I remember having a note here just written where some of the things that he outlines really helps guard against mob spirit. And I think that that's extremely powerful if you're really living towards your values and your principles, and you're not, giving in to what everybody else is doing, and not doing something you hate that is ethically against what your will is. Well, then that will help you guard yourself against going with the crowd. And I find that to be one of the most important traits in anybody, is to not necessarily give in to mob spirit.
Thank you, Joe. Next up is Hyman. Hyman, what do you think about rule number 5?
Yeah, I like
Not
two
do what
previous
you hate.
Roger and Joe said, but I also makes me think very strongly about, again, being self-aware. And a lot of times early on, we get dialed into a vocation or something that doesn't speak to us, doesn't allow us to really get in touch with source, or it prevents us from our true whatever that is speaking, and we compromise ourselves. So with this rule, it hit me very personally, because I was absorbed into a vocation that was a family business, and it was totally outside of what made me feel comfortable on many levels. So there's that thin line of having to, provide sustenance and being subjected to a certain amount of, compromise, and then breaking away from that, being self-aware and having the courage and the moral fiber, what have you, to reach into really works for you, and to dial out of that and to reach into what feels more comfortable and make that transition. It's obviously something that takes a tremendous amount of there's so many, hills that move through the process, but again, self-awareness and kind of stepping forward into being in touch with what your intuition leads into, and things of that nature. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Hyman. Next up is Maritza.
So this wasn't one of my top 3, but actually, looking at my notes for it, I was amused by what I put up, so I figured I would share it with you guys. I actually wrote something from one of his other rules, and it was a reminder that this "do not do what you hate" is a great way to treat yourself like someone you are responsible for helping. And then I actually put a quote from Sullivan's book, Kindergarten Chats. It says, "We are being timid and cowardly, unlovely, when we choose the habitual, the known, out of fear of chaos, of the unknown." I don't know, I guess to me that sounded like what I heard him saying for this room.
Nice. Thank you, Maritza. Dee, did you have something?
Yeah, I think rule number 5 speaks to me a lot because it's real life application in terms of, your daily life work. You can torture yourself and physically damage yourself if you are in a situation that you absolutely hate. So I think, it's good that we recognize that, this path that I'm going down is not going to work and I have to do something about it. So, you either make the choice of destroying yourself, or you make the choice of going forward and making yourself better.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dee. So next up is rule number 12. Many people voted for it. I think 4 or 5 people voted for it. So rule number 12 is be grateful in spite of your suffering. And I would definitely put rule number 1 and 12 as my favorite. That's a good way of writing a book, to start really strong and end strong. Then pretty much whatever you can do in the middle is gravy on the top of that. But so rule number 12, who would like to talk about rule number 12 and what they got from it? Victor.
So this one is really foreign to me. If I have to say one thing that I picked up that is really new, especially in terms of context, I would say this one, coming to the idea of suffering. Even for the idea of suffering, I'm a little foreign to it. And to see that particular idea through the eyes, through the context of gratefulness, that it made me think, and it made me read the chapter a couple of times. And that I have to say, it challenged me for sure, but I did pick up a few things.
That was actually a very interesting observation, that this rule was foreign to you. And I think that's something that I would like to ask everybody, what is there any rule in here which was kind of foreign to you, the sense which was not along, which you had the greatest difficulty with? Either you did not like, or it was unusual. So that at first glance, so we're talking about at first glance, it looked, whether afterwards you still thought that it was foreign, or it kind of grew on you. So at some point, I'm going to ask that question. So Kevin, what do you think about rule number 12?
My first reaction is that's a Taoism. Down can define up.
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Yeah, it's like a Tao concept, right? It's Tao can define up.
Mm-hmm.
Grateful compared to suffering. It's kind of yin and yang. It's finally back to Tao. That's the solution for society. You want happiness, inner peace. I feel that way.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else wants to share about rule number 12? Maritza.
So this rule number 12, was kind of opposite for me from Victor's reaction. This one was to me like a naturally kind of idea. It's probably the one rule of this book that I struggled with the least, because it seemed to me that it's almost common sense maybe, but again, everyone, and everyone's situation is different. And I have long been of the mind that if one were to sit down and start crying over those things in one's past that were hard or miserable or just genuinely failures, we'd never get up, right? If you focus on those things, you will just sit there and cry. And then what happens? You just have, red eyes and nothing accomplished. By, just shaking it off and getting up and just making a promise to yourself that you're going to be grateful that you can get up and shake it off, well, then now you've put yourself in, you've changed the perspective, and you've put yourself in a position where you can try to find something in addition to those negative things. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is going to be Joe, Jade, and David. Joe.
Yeah, so I was frantically looking for my notes. I don't have any of my notes. I misplaced them. So this is kind of going off the cuff. But the one thing I absolutely did remember from this particular chapter was, so you might love people despite their limitations, but you also love them because of their limitations. And I found that to be the most powerful part of that entire chapter, is that, the suffering, the limitations that we have, they're actually assets. And if you can reframe that, not only can you see that in yourself, but you will also see that in other people. And that allows you to see the best in other people. And so you also reframe what the limitation actually is. It's an asset. There was also a connection with it, and I don't know if we'll come to it with Rule 11, but we could also reframe our suffering as well. If we looked at it as totally a random act, we take a step back, we understand that other people are suffering in this process. And then we can but that is rule. Actually, I am getting off base. Okay, I'm going to stop. But the bottom line is that there is 11 and 12 fit nicely into one another. But the thing that it really did stick out to me is the importance of how we view our limitations and understand that suffering is actually a blessing.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Jade, followed by David. Jade, what did you think of rule number 12? Jade, you need to unmute yourself.
So I'm feeling as though rule number 12 is kind of complex for me, because I think it's one of those things where I read it and I recognize on some level there's nothing is necessarily wrong with anything that he said, but I kind of go through life with a alternate perspective of suffering. I don't necessarily think for everyone that suffering causes them to become harder or meaner. For some people, it kind of softens them. It helps them understand the world a little better and others a little bit better. And I think on some level, even right now, that has been a theme that I've been noticing, in the sense of patience with suffering and people who make you suffer. And the payoff that comes is not usually, is not immediate. It's almost never immediate, especially with people who make you suffer. But then out of the blue, every so often, someone will come out of the woodworks and surprise you. And you'll be like, it did get through. And it's like, I could think of some of my most challenging students when I would be hitting my head against the wall thinking, this kid is making me miserable. Like, what is the point? And sometimes I would say to them, because, you build a rapport after a while, like, why am I still talking? Like, I don't think this makes a difference. And, I even had a student who was like, no, because nobody talks to us. So it's like, I think the thing is, it's like we have, especially in terms of relationships, we have relationships and we think they're so awful and we're not getting through. But I think sometimes we don't give people the opportunity to prove that our suffering is worth something because we expect things to like snap like that. So it's like, to me, within this, I kind of really wonder if there's a way that we can examine our level of patience with situations that are frustrating, that cause us upset. Because like even our definitions of suffering, because I actually was having a conversation about suffering today with the group, and it just came up randomly, like not randomly completely, because the group was kind of a focused discussion anyway, but it's mind-boggling how just not getting what you want was also framed as suffering, even if it wasn't not getting something that would cause you any harm, it still was framed as suffering. So it's really, I don't know, to wrap my head around it. I feel like it's so layered, the concept of suffering, because we can drive each other crazy, and even Mother Nature likes to test our patience. But I really think it's valuable to really consider what we each personally consider suffering and what each of the people in our lives consider suffering. Where we'll get with that, I don't know, but being cognizant of things is usually the first step. That's my piece.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jade. Next up is going to be David, followed by Max. David.
Yes, thanks. Sorry, my voice is a little rough. I mean, the one thing that I noticed that so that's why I took a different approach to this chapter, but I noticed something different. I mean, I see that everybody is very much focused, and in the previous discussion now, on the suffering aspect of it. I mean, specifically the title. I mean, and I really, what always struck out to me about this chapter was the be grateful part of it. Because I mean, there's, in the rest of the chapter, Dr. Pearson is talking about courage in the face of suffering and this in the face of suffering. But, you know, one of the things that I've heard for a long time that's very important in life is practicing gratitude. And, you know, noticing and being grateful for things, for one's happiness and being able to thrive in life. And so I found it really interesting in the title that he says, be grateful in the spite of your suffering. So to me, I mean, I was even almost sort of ignoring the suffering part. I mean, sort of be grateful, not being grateful just despite your suffering, in spite of your suffering, not being grateful for your suffering, but in some ways being grateful that we're alive, for everything else, and that we can experience this. I mean, not that it's good to suffer, but that it's important to be grateful for all of these aspects of our life, maybe seeing something else in, I think as he sort of says in the chapter, beyond the person, in the person, understand that we're all damaged, imperfect human beings who are all suffering. And can you be grateful for the goodness? Can you see the goodness in somebody else, the goodness in these problems, the goodness in what you're experiencing? So I mean, that's sort of what I saw out of the chapter title. I didn't see it as much from the way he wrote in the chapter, and maybe it was missing, but I think that this, reminding us to be grateful, for life, or what we can experience. And I think it's only right at the, the end where he again repeats it to, be grateful. So that's what I thought was really an important aspect of at least the title of the chapter.
Excellent. That's a great observation. And I think just the idea of gratefulness, it's much larger than just its response to suffering. Thank you. Next up is Max. Max, go ahead. Let's see. I think Max is having some problem. Max, can't hear you. Nope, can't hear you. You need to fix your audio. Once you've fixed your audio, just go ahead and.
What about now? Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, cool. This chapter was a little different because when I read it in the book, it didn't say anything to me. My only kind of experience or kind of motivation I got from it was from the group. So there was one thing that really struck me when they said about being grateful, how that statement could be kind of oppressive or dismissive to a lot of people. And also, like Jade hinted on, just the different definitions of suffering. Because you get like someone with like these really big health issues and like the things they've been through, that suffering. Someone else could see suffering as simply like not getting the thing that they want. So like even when you're saying that word, like saying the same word but not speaking the same language, I thought was also pretty interesting. So I think the best thing about this chapter, and that's kind of like what I really liked about coming to these meetings, because this whole book, a lot of it, to be honest, it wasn't so valuable to me like when I first read it, but like the breakdowns of it in a different way that people interpret it and just like really like digging into it from like a different perspectives that I wasn't really capable of on my own.
Absolutely. Max, that was a fantastic observation. I think that's what we do in these meetups, because what happens is that these are all thoughtful people and they throw so many angles, they kind of illuminate the topic from so many different angles. And some of them really strike you. And so you go into it, even if you got something from it, I find that like people, it's like a chorus, right? People are coming at it from multiple angles and they're adding their own voice and own voice responding to the main theme. And so you're listening now in not just stereo, but you're suddenly, it's like the chapter is giving you like this melody, and suddenly you're getting this like entire orchestra responding to it. And it's a tribute to people who are here, that's what actually happens. And then you can see potentialities of that melody much more as a result of it. So thank you for pointing that out. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one to what Max was saying. This is one of the important questions that I remember having come up during the lightning round was, can you be grateful without suffering? And the necessity for suffering in our lives, and having how it actually allows us to be grateful. The other important part about that is not that I would not invalidate anybody's experience if it were too, if they've gone through something too horrible, but he does go into how people turn to nihilism in certain cases, as opposed to using it as a place of how to triumph over your current hardships. The other point was that really came out of that discussion was the distinction of comparing yourself to others, and how we went back and forth a little bit about that. And it wasn't necessarily about comparing yourself, but it's being aware of other people that allowed you to understand other people are going through something that is much more difficult than maybe what you're going through. And that allows you to transform your suffering into an appreciation for what you have. So that was an also important point at 12.
Excellent. All right. Next up is going to be rule number 6. Rule number 6, abandon ideology. What did you get from that? And what we are going to do is, we are not going to cover all the rules. We're going to cover some rules, and then I want to do an intermission where we're going to talk. I want to actually ask you why these meetups work. What is it about these meetups? I'm too familiar with it. And so I want to ask, what is it that make this meetup work? What are the values that you get from it? And why do you think they work? Okay, so that's, I'm going to ask that immediately after discussing rule number 6, which is abandon ideology. Max.
I think this was my favorite rule because it's another thing where on my own I kind of skipped past the gravity of it, but when we came to group, I was really able to like break it down and just like how heavy that is, like the strength of ideologies in today's age. Like just the like I didn't consciously like signify put things into that category before, but then I realized like how many people are like falling behind ideologies and just like abandoning like critical thinking for their own and being able to appreciate other perspectives. So I think like this chapter was like more than for me, this was like the best one in the book. And I think it spoke a lot about the things that, have been affecting Jordan Peterson and he's pretty aware of it. But it also was one of the ones that really like kind of came across and affects me in my daily life. So yeah, really good.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anybody else? Becky.
I agree exactly with what Max just said. It causes you to be lazy. You give up on critical thinking, and it destroys the possibility of having real conversations. You're not talking to someone, you're talking at a belief. And we're complicated. We don't actually believe everything that one party says or one concept represents. And we're filled with contradictions as people. And as we progress through our lives, our thoughts and understanding of things change with maturity, with experience, with incorporating new thoughts into or new ideas into what we actually believe. And the thing with ideology is that when you experience true, like when you're experiencing suffering or hardships, they don't hold you. It's what you really have taken in that holds you, that keeps you together. And your ideology is just they're nothing but empty. So I love this. This is one of my favorite chapters.
Excellent. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Joe, Victor, Hyman, and Jade. Joe.
I mean, I think that this is, again, one of my favorite chapters as well. And I think it's critical to the book itself, primarily because if you're challenging your ideology, that is a form of chaos. You're entering something that is your unknown, or you're something that you don't believe in. And then when you're bringing that into your when you're doing that, that can be fearful. I mean, it can be scary, because not only what you do, if not only by challenging it, it's also that it may upend a whole other set of belief systems that you have. So, and that's important. And I think that he also talks about the idea of how you can become tyrannical if you become too ideological. And that's also important too, because you become closed off from the world and you're not listening to anybody else. And it's perhaps, I think, the biggest problem that we're facing in the United States today. If I were to say there were one particular problem, is that we are unwilling to even challenge our ideologies. And that problem is essentially breaking down. You can't have any conversations with anybody, and it's happening all over. And so I think that this is perhaps the most important part of the book, and it also speaks to Peterson's willingness to I think to challenge, his map of the world, or challenge our maps of the world, which is, again, that's something that's very much needed in today's world. I didn't capture it as well as I wanted, but I for life of me, I can't find my notes, but I'm looking.
That was pretty good. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Victor.
For me, this particular rule is a corollary to rule number 1. in a sense that if we have a certain ideology, we can belong to one of two groups, and one of two groups, we can idealize it, which in turn makes us to hate or look down upon the other side. And in Maps of Meaning, he expands the definition of ideology, and he goes in to say, ideologies are incomplete myths. They have a blind eye towards the other side. And that's one point. And he also goes into the root of where the ideologies come from. And at that point, he gives an example. He mentions Nietzsche's story about how we killed God. And then he goes into this idea of we will have to create our own gods. But one more thing to look at is we always have this intention to belong to something. Ideologies are a very good temptation points to go belong to something. And if we can't think clearly or critically, it's easy to fall into any one group of ideologies. So him bringing up all these things and cleanly explaining all these things actually gives a very good idea why they work, and the problems in ideologies, instead of just making a statement, don't belong to anything. But he going into the root, I really like it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Victor. Next up is Hyman, Jade, and Rami. Hyman.
Yes. I like what Victor said. The people tend to associate themselves to an ideology or an opinion or a group, and then it prevents them from being open up the other side of that. Cognitive dissonance. When you communicate with people, you have to be diplomatic and very cautious when you share information, because the ego, we're wrapped into the idea of we want to be right. And an intelligent discourse is, as Dr. Peterson says, is being able to allow the other person, whatever they're conveying, whatever they're saying, actually listen to it without trying to fight against it or have an opinion about it. Just allow it to sink in under the presupposition that they might very well have something that you can take away from their conversation. So very, very good point. And I think it is problematic today. I speak to a lot of young people if I'm talking about the politics of food or the certain information that I want to convey or give over, regardless what it is, you have to tread very cautiously, because people are locked into the idea that what they know is what they know. And they might have adapted that reasoning or that understanding from someone that they associate with as a protector, or someone that they believe to be in the know. Or it's just we have to keep an open mind. It's a really great rule, and it allows us to understand that there's a bigger conversation with just what we think we know. We can always learn and take away and expand into a higher element or division of our intellect. Thank you.
Thank you, Hyman. Next up is Jade, followed by Rami. Jade.
I think what this chapter, I'm trying to remember it perfectly, but I don't know that I remember it perfectly. It was so long ago. Everyone kind of has a feeling that I ask a lot of questions, so ideology doesn't get ingrained in me that easily. I don't internalize it that well, but I still sense that there is purpose to it. And I sense on some level, if we're going to be matching rules, it's kind of like you can't dismantle somebody's ideology just like that, because it can become messy, because it's the foundational, it's what people live on, and you can end up giving them an existential crisis, because what do you do? So it's how do you I feel like it's one of those things where you kind of have to understand it. And if you can't dismantling something you don't understand can be detrimental. And I'm also feeling especially when it comes to the mind and changing things inside our minds, it's more about helping facilitate a breakthrough than it is a breakdown. And if you pull out the wrong piece, it's like Jenga, the whole thing comes crashing down. And then what is that person to do? You just broke their whole sense of self and the world. That's not cool. So I guess I'm just gonna raise questions, and is like how because I'm also not remembering a lot of conversation about what do you replace ideology with quite as much. And from my perspective, I think I've also been ingrained, it matched that I was raised to have a principled life as opposed to like rigid structures, because principles are flexible. You look at a situation, you can make decisions relative to what's going on in front of you. So I don't know. I think it's interesting, but even principles are difficult because some people don't understand their principles. So people will say, love thy neighbor. And you're like, well, what does that look like? And they can't tell you. So even principles leave you with a gray area, but at least there's a bit of flexibility. So there's no answer there, really. It's just more observations, but we just got to be careful when dealing with each other. I think that's what it always boils down to.
Great observations. Thank you, Jade. Next up is Rami.
In response to Victor Paul, let's take the case of two ideologies. Let's say those who claim the universe is boundless and those who claim it is bounded. Does holding either view mean a person holding the other view detracts in any way from their humanity?
Okay. Victor, do you want to respond to that? We're not doing too much back and forth, but go ahead. Victor, if you would like to.
Well, the idea is to look at both arguments. The intention of this particular rule is that not to be blinded by one particular argument. I think that is what he's getting at. And even I hold that particular opinion.
Okay. So what we'll do, Rami, I don't know whether that addressed your question. Maybe we're not doing too much back and forth, but if you want to make a comment about ideology, you're welcome to do that.
Only that it can be a trap.
Okay, wonderful. So folks, what I want to do is the next stage, I want to take a slight intermission of kind of looking at these meetups itself and saying what value we get from the meetups. And then I want to build on everything that we have done. So we will take rules, 2 rules at a time. We will compare, we'll try to import rules from 12 rules for life and compare it with these rules here. And so I want to do kind of working with the rules. So, but first I want to ask everybody, because I've been thinking about this. I want to make one comment about ideology. I've been studying this Walter Ong guy, and he's very deep, and he pretty much, what he says about language has to do with almost everything that I can think of. So his statement regarding ideology is actually much more deeper. He says, all text is pretext. He uses this aphorisms. All text is pretext. What is he saying? He's saying that we have a tendency, by naming something or creating an ideology or creating even an idea, we tend to replace reality with that, not realizing that it's a name, it's some capturing aspects of things. And then you just run with the ideology itself or the idea itself and forget the entire context from which it came, even if it was validly come up with, you just run with that. So that's what he means by text, all text is pretext. And my kind of adjoining to, kind of expansion of that is all text is pretext because it is missing the context, because it is the context which gives rise to the observations that you make. And you always, and often it captures only some aspect, essential aspect, hopefully, but only some aspect of context. And there is a lot more in that context, and you have to be alive to that. One of the advantages of the conversations that we have is that and this is again a point that Walter Ong makes, is this marriage of writing and speaking. When you speak about things that you have written or that you have read, it allows you to actually explore all the connections around it. So that way you're, and doing that with multiple people who are coming at it from different contexts allows you to eliminate various aspects of the text. So that's a great way of looking at text. And ideology is all about taking some text and saying that is the word. And regarding all parts of the world which seem to contradict with that text to be bad. So let's so folks, so my question, I just want to keep it short, but anything, what is it that make these meetups worthwhile? What is it that you get from it? What is it that is unique to them? Any observations that you have? Roger.
One of the reasons I've always loved this is because you always get different interpretations and different takes. So it's always nice to have, you always are going to process the world in a certain way, but then having someone else point to that exact same thing that you're trying to process and interpret, and then look at it from a completely different way, that kind of gives you, it's a very postmodern perspective to some extent, right? But with Peterson's view of there's still there's a lot of multiple interpretations of the world, but there's only certain viable ones. So being able to compare notes with the other people who are also trying to interpret something that's quite complicated, and essentially you're attempting to interpret the writings of a man who's attempting to interpret something that's quite complicated, right? So you're already several layers in, and then sharing notes and making sure that what you're seeing isn't just you seeing it yourself, which tends to be an indication that might not be what he was aiming at, or it might still be useful, right? But yeah, that sharing of information, which I think is the whole, quite literally Peterson's religion of, the worshiping of the logos, where through truth good appears. And it's like through sharing information and being honest with that shared information and interpretation, what comes of that exchange will naturally be good, right? So I've always thought that this is a good manifestation of that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And folks, you can talk about any of the meetups. So I'm just looking at this general format that we have and what it is that it does for us and what makes it work. So it's going to be Rami, Joe, Dave, Kevin, and Max. Rami.
Quite frankly, it's your conductorship. It's like moving on a train. It's always going, and you just keep it plugging away.
Thank you. Thank you, Rami. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to say something. The lightning round and how you're able to clarify those questions and make them meaningful so that we can all answer them is, it really makes it 10 times. It makes it much more interactive, and it gets us all thinking. But again, I agree with Roger that it's, these incredibly complex topics, and the more that you hear people that are giving their perspective on how they arrived at certain conclusions, the more I say, aha, that's and as much as I absolutely loathe going first whenever, like all the time, it does do something. It's kind of like, all right, it's out there, but then I hear everybody else, and I kind of really do benefit from going first, in the sense that it's kind of really, I'm looking at my thoughts in a different way. I may never forgive Roger for not coming for 8 weeks and doing that, but I know, I'm just joking. But no, that was no, it's definitely the feedback that I get, and I find this to be, this has been a gift from everyone, and again, especially Roger, Victor, and Claire, who have put in quite a bit of time, and Pegor as well, just in curating the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And regarding Roger, I think there's Shakespeare said something about absence makes the heart grow fonder or something like that. And we're going to be going into the Bible series, so we'll have plenty of Roger, hopefully. So looking forward to that. Next up is going to be Dave, Kevin, Max, and Pegor. Dave, what makes these conversations work?
Shrikant, my great friend, this has been going on for a little more than a year now, and I'm one of your regulars, but I think you're handling it very well. I think the main idea is, to me, you've told your story a few times that you did this to educate yourself, and you've invited the rest of us along on your journey. And I think we're eternally grateful. The one comment I'd make that I think a lot of different things, there's important principles. I think, you're trying to control it so everyone that wants to participate can. There are obviously sometimes some people that just want to listen and leave their screen dark, and bless them. But also keep it so no one monopolizes. So I think you've got some good running rules. The one comment I make it, sometimes the presentation I think needs to vary a little bit. Sometimes you have someone giving a presentation that's very detailed, very new information, and then we go into breakout rooms and there's nothing to discuss. And to me, it's like a TED talk, and that's a wonderful thing. Where then it's usually, I would think, like a Q&A format after such a presentation would be much more appropriate, that anyone can ask questions they want to. So I think, you may want to adapt a little bit. And the other thing I was going to say about the Bible series, and I was listening to Roger's series, it was going for a while, that we listened to an hour video. And I would think, well, and we are a smaller group, and, Roger would kind of lead discussions, but I would think if we do it in this group where we have 30 people, I would suggest we listen to about an hour video and then immediately go into breakout rooms, because we've all seen it and we all get the main ideas and we talk about it, and then come back with takeouts or, takeaways, final questions or something like that. And I think hope you saw an email I sent you of 3 old documentaries. They're 50 years old, but they're fascinating. Of course, Joseph Campbell, Power of Myth, but The Ascent of Man, I think a lot of us would remember, I turned it on YouTube I wanted to look at it for a minute or two, and I couldn't turn off. I watched the whole hour episode because it was fascinating. I think they said it was, BBC was initiating a new channel, and they wanted this spectacular thing, and this guy is traveling the whole world, showing the birth of human race in Africa. But I think something like that could be run a similar format. There's wonderful documentaries. But again, thank you for a wonderful journey. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm very familiar with Ascent of Man. It's one of my favorites. Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Max, and Pegor. What makes these meetups work?
Yes, thank you, Sank. I would say first about yourself and your team. Victor, Rogers, Claire, Pegor. If you wish, I would say audience, we just not audience, we are participant, very active. Your inspiration make me thinking, push me like, let's see, bring your best question after breakout. That's, your people sometimes little, even that one finger, maybe can, lift that level to the earth, lift up. That's, like from passive be active. I'm slower kind of, you normally begin to start. And also topic. The topic you think, let's say a little bit over, this is Jordan Peterson work, other work, I'm very interested. By the way, I'm like, my style, like learning is butterfly. However, I stick your topic, you say that. Yeah, I mean, like more than a joke, I guess. No, slowly, yeah. Another one, I would see it's you also your rules is such such a value. Try embrace everything open-minded yourself and try hear each other. For me, I'm just not learn from the presenter yourself and others, especially who people speak. So thank you so much. I'm quiet, but I'm listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate the observations. Thank you. Max, followed by Pegor. Max, what do you
Hello,
think?
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I agree with I think a lot of the things have been said already. Obviously, like the structure that you put in place, it like maximizes interaction. It really gives everybody a very, comfortable and calm environment to speak in. Also, it kind of influences people to think and see things outside of what they would normally see. So like the structure and the way that it's set up, I think is the best thing. And also just the format. So I like how the information is set out, then the breakout rooms, then the reformat. So you have like a lot of different kind of like opportunities to like step in there and really, interact and put your ideas out as well. So that kind of adds to pool. So I think that might be the biggest thing because it just really maximizes the amount of people who are like inputting. And the more input is the more perspectives. And ultimately that's the most learning. So that's the whole point of these groups.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Max. Great observations. Next up is Pegor, followed by Victor.
Hello. So first of all, I'd say you, Shrikant, you're very sharp. You make sure that everyone has a chance to speak, and then the community, like starting from Roger, Claire, Victor, and then Joe, Becky, Dave, all the regulars, Maritza. It's just I hate to let someone not to mention someone, but like everyone's a regular. We have a big group of regulars, and that sort of creates a consistency. You get to know people. I've noticed that our like pre-session chats have gotten more like personal. We're talking more about like personal matters, and that's sort of what matters. I was in a similar meetup in Lebanon, not about Peterson, but like general, and there was a core group of regulars, and that's why I kept going because there was the core group of regulars, and I think that's the most important thing about this group and this set of meetups is that there are familiar faces and you get to know them over time.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Pegor. Great observations. Next up is Victor, followed by David. Victor.
Well, I think the topics themselves are really interesting. That, first of all, grabs the attention and gets us in. And once we get in, I think there's a very good balance of order and chaos. I'd say there's a very good structure. And at the same time, it's interesting, just like the rapid rounds that we do and the questions, even just in like last few weeks, a few changes that kept things interesting. And the breakout rooms, they let us speak for a longer period of time so that we can formulate our thoughts and exchange ideas. Those are really interesting. And when we come back, there is so much context, like Roger and Joe were mentioning. There are so many contexts you can look through, and especially with the other person's experiences and the way they are looking at it, that makes the topic itself more richer in our own head to understand us better. And any couple of hours we spend here, we'll get enough to think about for a whole week. So in that regard, I really like this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Victor. I really like the observations. Next up is David, followed by Jade. David.
Yeah, I'd say that the most important is the dynamics of the group. I think that I've been in a number of different groups over a few decades, and it really is about the people. And I'd say that it comes back to you, Shrikant, for creating the environment and the structure to attract. Both the topics and the people, and keeping things focused, keeping things sort of apolitical, keeping things open for respectful disagreement. that's the topics, everything that makes it attract very high caliber people. I mean, including yourself and your esteemed and incredible depth and experience. But so I think it's the people, but it's a matter of that your structure and guidance of this attracts and maintains that group of enlightened people. And I mean, we've known each other for, I don't know, 5 years now, or we've been doing this, that there's been a turnover in this group. I mean, people who've come and gone. I mean, fortunately, some of the very good members aren't participating anymore, but it's always been this core group of people that is we attract other really interesting, really insightful, bright people. So it's always kept this sort of top caliber as people drift away for whatever reason, other people join, and that it's the context of this group. I'm trying to figure out how to politely phrase this, that people who don't want to be congenial rapidly find something else to do.
Okay, well put. Thank you, David. Next up is Jade, followed by D. Jade.
I want to avoid reiterating stuff other people said, but I will say that it's a discussion group where people are allowed to actually discuss things. The word that comes to my mind is heterodoxy. It's a word that's floating around a lot now. It's basically the opposite of orthodoxy. So basically you could deviate from what is considered like the norm, the standard, like you're allowed to branch out and think about new things. Clearly I need that, because every chapter of the book, I was like, I don't see that. Like, that's not, that's not my thing. So if it's not, and I'm supposed to come and I'm supposed to just like echo chamber the book, it's not gonna work. For me personally, it's just not gonna work. Or I'll be there and I'll just be like the fly in the ointment, which I might be. Y'all just might be that polite that you don't, give me a hard time about it. But either way, it's appreciated. So I think that's my 2 cents on it.
Wonderful. And I would say, I mean, you've contributed so much, because what happens is that it just, you always eliminate the edge of whatever people are talking about. So that you always say, this is what they're saying, but what about this? Look at this and look at that. And all of that is critical. It's the same point about text and pretext. You don't let text be pretext. You're saying, what about that though? Very nice. Next up is D.
Yeah, I would say, very much like I came very late into the group. So I'm a neophyte in comparison to all of you, but I do enjoy the group. I do enjoy the dynamics of the diversity of the group and the thinking, when Jade interjects, her original thinking, it brings to mind that there is another way of thinking. I mean, the majority thinks in one direction, but throwing that other context in does make you think, and it adds, a lot of expansion into one's own self. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dee. So folks, thank you very much for these, for all these observations. Because what happens is that when you're doing something, you don't have a full perspective on it. So it's always good to kind of take time to kind of listen to what other people have to say, because you do not know what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and you get a little better perspective just by hearing. So thank you. All right, so let's go back to the rules. So there are 2 directions in which I want to go. One is to bring in 12 rules for life, and second is to look at connections between rules. Okay, so how about, we don't have that much time, so let's do both of them together. So now it's about connecting the rules. So you can take any rule, and anybody, everybody is welcome to do that. You can take any rule. Let's start with some rules from 12 rules for life, ones that you have found useful, and look at the connections between rules from 12 rules to life and rules in Beyond Order. And you can do it in any, so it's kind of connect up the rule game, okay? and you can use your creativity to do it in any which way you would like to do this. Okay. So first up is going to be Maritza, followed by Pegor. Maritza.
So from 12 Rules of Life, my absolute favorite rule is number 8, and that is do not lie. I'm sorry, it's tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And that's a very, very lofty rule to set for oneself, near impossible to follow exactly into the letter. But as a goal, I can think of none better. I mean, it's kind of like, people say that shoot for the stars shoot for the moon. And if you fail, you're still going to land in the stars or something like that. That's the way I envision that rule, that it's yes, that is going to be the moniker for which to always aim. And I will say that I found that many of the rules in Beyond Order this rule could be woven into them as a subset of the rule providing. And to me, it's an interesting thought experiment to consider. So if the 12 rules, the initial 12 rules, were suggestions or guides for us to create order out of chaos, and then these additional 12 rules are the opposite, and it's a way to create, or to embrace some chaos within the order. I find it really interesting to consider that setting the rule for oneself to attempt to be truthful actually tackles both order and chaos. And it's really interesting to me from the perspective of human beings lie. It's what we do. It's what we do. We lie, and so the task is to do it less, or create some awareness within yourself so that you are not carelessly just telling falsehoods everywhere, right? Because it's to your detriment and to the detriment of others around you. So with that in mind, like I can almost, and I have taken maybe I get bored too much, but not bored, I've never been bored, but random things. What I have done is I have gone through these rules, and I have, there's a lot of rules I had issues with. Like this was not, I'm with Max. Max had to sign off, but I agree with him a lot that by itself, had I read this book, I would have found very small value. And I would have bemoaned the fact that Peterson didn't stop at the previous book. But, so in addition with the group here and so many other perspectives that were being provided, I go back and I sit and I'm like, okay, I don't see all of this. So I have gone through the rules and tried to see what I can weave into them to see how they would work for me. And this is actually what I've come up with. Like, the strongest one is do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Well, that's almost exactly saying that, tell the truth, but what it's saying, the nice thing of this, the inverse, is that it's saying, don't lie to yourself. The first rule says, don't lie in general. It doesn't matter to whom, but this one specifically says, in case I wasn't clear enough before, this also means you. Don't lie to yourself. And I really like this admonition of, lying to yourself is as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than lying to others. But also it's that duality, because, Jade made a comment to us during this rule about maybe some things need to be left in the fog. And that's, again, but again, that is something that can only be determined if we are trying valiantly to be true to ourselves. And so it's, you know, that's the only way you can determine in which direction that you'll fall. So I'm gonna stop there, but I can see how that rule works for so many of these.
Wonderful. I just want to follow up with the comment that you made about Max's comment, that you get a lot more value from the discussions. And I think that's a tribute, not only to the conversation format that we have, but the quality of people that are attracted by this format, where they can engage with each other at this level. And what it does is that it just increases the richness of what you're exploring, because you're exploring this entire kind of context around everything that is there. And in no other meetup, it is as clear as in the Tao Te Ching, because Tao Te Ching, it's like this little poem, okay? And when you see everybody discuss it, it just explodes in your mind of seeing just so many different implications, thanks to so many different people coming at it. So it's wonderful, and it's all tribute to the great people, you know, who keep coming here. Thank you. Next up is Pegor, followed by Joe. Pegor.
Yeah, so I'm gonna tie three rules from this book, because while we were voting, I got the idea. So the three rules are the first one, which is do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievements. Rule 5, do not do what you hate. And rule 11, do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. First of all, they all start with do not, which I find interesting. And the thing that I sort of connected them with is they all have to do with resentment. And the theme, and I think it's the theme of the book, is that resentment is an indicator time for you around you to go beyond established order into chaos to update the order that you're living in. It's like this warning sign. Because if you feel resentment, you're gonna either do it voluntarily, update the order voluntarily, or you're gonna end up like doing a mass shooting and bringing chaos upon everyone, which will then reestablish a new order. And so, if resentment is your warning, is your alarm, be careful.
Beautiful, wonderful thing. You know how to play this game, Pegor. Next up is Joe, followed by Becky. Joe.
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, I see a lot of rule 6, and I agree with what has been said. You know, you can kind of see parts of, you know, tell the truth, at least don't lie, in every part of this, and the importance of sins of omission and sins of commission. But you know, one thing that kept coming back to me is rule 6 in the previous book, which is set your house in perfect order, and how there's been this running theme of kind of resentment, specifically in rule 11, but there was in other rules as well, is how you handle these adverse conditions that that life inevitably will put you in. And he gives the example of the murderer that I'm forgetting his name, Pansram or something along those lines, how he went one way and another one of his patients went another way and was still dealing with, he was an artistic person, and how, you know, we have these choices. And he highlights a lot of these same scenarios in Beyond Order, in the sense that some people have ways of giving into despair and nihilism, but in other ways, they can take that nihilism and take their suffering and see it as something that is an asset, or as a gift. So basically reframe it. So I think that there's a lot of that in where you can kind of see us, we can go either way. And I see a lot of rule 6 with that. Pursue what is meaningful is also in there, which was essentially rule 2. there's a lot of crossover with that as well. You know, imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that. There was another one in there that was, I want to say, compare yourself to who you were yesterday was also, but I'm forgetting which rule that would have mapped to in my head. But the bottom line is that not only, I think these are bookends for maps of meaning. Essentially, that's the way I look at these two books. You know, they really do have maps of meaning in every single part of their book. One is just focused a little bit more on chaos and the other one on order. I think there's a lot of order in this particular book. But it's, you know, I think it does a lot to call out what chaos is. I have a better understanding of what chaos is because of that. But yeah, and something that I read was interesting, that this is black.
Mhm.
And because the book cover is black because of the yin, and the white is for the, you know, for the yang. So that's the order and that's the chaos. So that was interesting too. Little Dallas action there. So
Wonderful. I want to say one thing. I mean, this is a difficult thing to write a second book, okay? Because Jordan Peterson has a philosophy, you know, which runs through all these books and all his videos. It's a philosophy. And, you know, he started with those 42 Quora rules, and he picked the best 12 he possibly could. When you're writing a first book, you're going to write it as if that is it. And so in that sense, it is very hard to do a second book on the same material, because it's like you're covering the same area. You know, your philosophy is the same. You just have to add something to it. So it is a difficult thing to kind of top the first book. Go ahead, Joe.
especially when you're trying to bring order to chaos, this gets really hard. And I think people maybe discount that. It's the idea that not only, okay, you're not only going to engage with chaos, but you're going to bring order to it. So of course there's going to be some overlap because you already are talking about order to begin with. So there is going to be a lot of similarities in there. It's just a question of how you can really capture the essence of chaos. And I think he does a pretty good job of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is kind of, I mean, order and chaos are the concepts that run throughout. So in that sense, you know, there is a lot of chaos in the first book and there is a lot of order in the second book. So it's just, his entire thought is about the balance. So he has to bring that in quite a bit. And I personally did not see it as being, you know, I was hoping that it would be more about chaos. I don't think it was that much about chaos at all. It was kind of around the same. I saw it as being kind of the same thing. Maybe it will twisted a little bit this way or that way, but I don't think it is kind of a dramatically different kind of a book. I see it as kind of filling out. It says like you do a spine, you kind of come up with like a structure like this, and then you put something in, you know, in between to kind of fill it out, because you just have that much to say in the same direction and you're just filling it out. But next up is going to be Becky, Jade, and Victor. Becky.
I think that for there are two things that I want to talk about, but it's structuring your relationships and then structuring your environment. So from the first book, it was do not let your children do anything that makes you dislike them. And then from the second book, plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationship. So that was more of structuring your relationships. And the family unit is our first model of what to expect from the world. So it's extremely important to get these things right. And so that was the tie. And from there, just branching off a little bit more was rule 3 from the first book: make friends with people who want the best for you. And then the second part was that I mentioned of like structuring your environment was set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And then from the second book, try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. Next up is going to be Jade, followed by Victor. Jade.
I think I don't know if I remember the questions because I was listening to everyone, but what came to mind started with Maritza. And I think the do not hide unwanted things in the fog was one of the chapters that stuck out, particularly because as there are probably aspects of Jordan Peterson I'd rather, banish to the fog, but I don't. Like I do, but I don't. Like I see him, all of him. So in its entirety, I'm not going to make him into someone I want him to be. He is who he is. I see it, and then I'm like, no, I don't need to look at that all the time. And I think that's the great thing about the book, because the first book, I tried to read it, I couldn't finish it. If I'm honest, I didn't finish this one either. I got pretty much through it, but then I was just like, I can't do it twice. Like read it and then talk. No, I can't do both. But what I would say is that, sorry, I wrote all over the place because I was trying to listen to people. So I took notes like I normally do, but I don't remember what I was going to say.
How about this? Let's go to Victor and then you can come back. The question was, yes. How would you connect? This is a game for connecting different rules.
That's what I wanted to say, is that all of the rules are intertwined. Like, I think that was his point, is to give people a kind of a more comprehensive approach to going towards life. And yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, no, that's a great observation. That it's like what you're doing is that you're basically saying you have a philosophy and you're trying to communicate it with these crisp little statements. All of which together give you a better sense instead of just one or two. So it's like multiple ways of pointing to the same thing. Thanks. Next up is going to be Victor.
I'd like to talk about rule number 8. And one thing Peterson is known for, that's he talking about clean your room. I'm pretty certain that it's not explicitly mentioned as a rule, but I just want to compare between the idea of clean your room and what he says while he says that, and with rule number 8. So when he says clean your room, the idea is to clean the clutter. Well, literally, in literal sense, of course, if we take it metaphorically, to get your things in order. So if that is the idea behind clean your room, it nicely fits with rule number 8, where it says, try to make your room, one room in your home, as beautiful as possible. And here there's a connection, and there is also a clear difference. Here he doesn't mention just to clean the room, but he mentions to make it as beautiful as possible. And here he goes in to say what beauty is and what it can do to us. In a literal sense, the art itself, any kind of beauty, brings a new way to look at things. And to take that idea just metaphorically, it fits nicely into rule number 2, where the idea is imagine who you could be and aim single-mindedly at that. Meaning to imagine something and to make it as beautiful as possible. So in that regard, clean your room and rule number 8 fits perfectly, literally and metaphorically for me.
Wonderful. Excellent. Fully agree. Dave, what do you think about connecting various rules?
I have an ironic statement for you. If you remember last week in our exciting episode, I said my favorite rule, according to Joe's question, was that treat yourself as you would helping another person, which to me was the most important thing in the first book. And I really identified with that because I counsel people a lot of times that we'll do anything for somebody else, but we very much neglect ourselves. But the ironic thing was, and as I said, I'd forgotten even what rule it was. So I've got both books here. I looked at, it's rule number 2 in the first book. And then I started looking at the second book, The Beyond Order, and the rule number 2 in the second book about, they take the straight aim, the concentration, and the focus towards your goal is the second rule in the second book. So I thought that's today's irony, that I like the second rule in both books. But both of them spoke to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. All right, folks. So this brings us to the end of this series, and we're going to start off with the Bible series. And I'll talk to Roger, and we're going to start. Roger, we're going to start with the first lecture next time.
Yeah, we'll probably start. If I remember correctly, he kind of goes all over the place. So we'll probably pick a couple of good points and then kind of, I don't know if you would like me to either give a real short presentation of just a summary of what his point is, we're on the same page, and then kind of have people discuss those.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea that we discussed that you pick kind of specific points.
Okay.
Because the way he talks, he goes all over the place. What we found, we just like, I wanted to get people's feedback to kind of to make sure, what value people are getting from these meetups. And one of the core value is actually the conversation. So in Tao Te Ching is very, very clear, because the material is very sharp and delimited. A lot of people can discuss it in a very focused way, and that conversation produces enormous amount of value. So I think you kind of separating out, saying, okay, these are the key points, is going to make it the conversation to be very deep.
Yeah, just kind of define the game and then let people play.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. All right, folks. So it's going to be the first chapter, and then we will go ahead and keep giving more details to you as we go on. All right. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for all the feedback. Really appreciate that. I'm, as I said, I'm always tremendously grateful to everybody who is here and all the values that you bring, and just the way in which you express yourself. So I learned so much. So I'm the most fortunate because I'm here most of the time. I don't know how, but Joy is here more than me. But so anyway, it's wonderful. Thank you very much. See you soon. Bye. Bye.